How's it going, YouTubers? Today I'll be showing you all how to service wheel bearings. Now this is off of a mid-2000 Ford Ranger, but the concept of serviceable wheel bearings are pretty similar. First I'll go over the tools I'll be using, then we'll go over the disassembly, inspection, and installation. Let's get started. Now the first tool is the dust cap remover. I highly recommend one of these because you can reuse your dust cap instead of damaging it. Now this one hammers on the edge and you could pry it outwards to remove the dust cap. Second, you need a hammer and a long punch. I have this brass punch right here, but you could use a steel one also. I have a heavy duty cotter pin remover. This is not needed. You could usually get away with just diagonal cutters, but this assists me with those stubborn cotter pins. This is my Nippex diagonal cutters. I've been using it for a long time, haven't failed. And I use slip joint pliers for the spindle nut, or you can actually use a socket and a ratchet. Now let's get started with the dust cap. Now usually when you see a dust cap, inspect if there's any damage like this one. So the last technician that worked on this most likely used a chisel to hammer it for the lip, and he pried it open. And what that does is it allows moisture and water to get inside, and then it could start rusting out the components inside. Now I'm going to show you how I use my tool to remove it properly. Now you just slip the jaws on both ends, and what you're going to do is you're going to hammer it on the side, and that'll form a gap. Once you form the gap, you could pry the tool and then the dust cap comes off. You see I'm positioning it, and with a couple of taps you can see it popped out a little bit, and then you could pry the cap right off. Now with the cap off, we can remove the cotter pin. So with the cotter pin, I can just use the diagonal cutters and remove most cotter pins. But for those stubborn cotter pins, you can use the heavy duty cotter pin remover with the assist of the pliers and remove it. Now after you remove the cotter pin, you can remove the retainer, the spindle nut retainer. Followed by the spindle nut itself. Now with the spindle nut, you can use a plier or a socket to remove. It shouldn't be tight at all. It should be just enough preload for the bearings so there's no play side to side or up and down. Now after removing the nut, we're going to remove the outer bearing and the washer together. Now if you tug the rotor or the hub just slightly, it should pop out. Now here's the outer bearing and the washer. You're going to be cleaning this up and start inspecting the race and the bearing itself. Now there's a trick where you reinstall the spindle nut and then you pull the actual hub or rotor out, and then that'll remove the inner bearing and the seal. Now I'm not going to be doing this because I'm planning on reusing these bearings and seals. If I were to have new bearings and seals, I'll be doing this trick. Now here's the inner bearing and seal, still encased with the hub and rotor. So this is how the inner bearing and the seal sits inside the rotor. So after you put the nut on and pull the rotor out, what's going to happen is the bearing is going to get caught on that nut, separating the bearing and the seal from the rotor. Now this is why I don't use that trick if I'm reusing the bearings. If you accidentally hit the outside cage of those bearings, that's going to reduce the service life of that bearing. So what I do instead, I use a long punch, either brass or metal, feel for the inner ring of the bearing. You can use the punch to push away all the grease so you have a better look at it. Once you find that ring, what you're going to do is you're going to tap it side by side until it comes out. It shouldn't take too much effort. So you see right there, that inner ring, and that's what you're going to hit. So I'm going to use the punch, give it a light tap on both sides. And once the bearing comes out, it's going to push out the inner seal also. Now you're going to be washing this bearing and seal so you can thoroughly inspect it, see if it's reusable. So to review, that inner ring is where I was hitting side by side. And you want to avoid the cage that's outside. And here's the seal that's untouched. It should usually be reusable, but you can inspect the seal and how it hugs the spindle after it's clean. Here's the seal before it's installed, and this is when it's installed. And it should hug around that ring in the spindle really nice. Now let's review everything we took off. This is the inner bearing, which is the bigger bearing. Here's the inner seal. This is the outer bearing, which is the smaller bearing. Bearing washer. Spindle nut retainer. Cotter pin. And the dust cap. After wiping down and cleaning all your bearings, this is the best time to determine the condition of your bearings and race. Check for rust, indicating moisture has seeped in from either your seal or your dust cap, uneven wear, pitting on the bearings, or heat marks. Now here's a little diagram of what I removed. Starting from the right side, I first removed the dust cap, then the cotter pin, which is not shown in the picture, then the spindle nut retainer, and then I removed the spindle nut. There will be a washer, then it's the outside bearing, outer bearing, and then what's going to be entrapped of the rotor or the hub is going to be the inner bearing and the inner seal. Now during my inspection, I noticed this wear on the inside and outside of my spindle. Now what this is caused by is insufficient lubrication in between the race and the spindle. Now I'm going to show you with it installed, the ring actually spins on the spindle if there's insufficient lubricant. Now this is when it's installed, and while you're driving, the outside bearing is moving. And then you see the inner ring is actually spinning on that spindle. And if there's no lubrication, it's going to start wearing down that spindle, and then there's a chance that it could be stuck. And then that's when you have to start cutting the bearing to remove, and then you can actually need a spindle in the long run. So during reassembly, make sure everything is greased well. Now for those that are fortunate to have a greasing machine, I'm going to teach you how you can pack all 4 bearings in one go instead of packing it one by one. So if you stack it in this order from big to small, you can actually pack all of them in a few pumps. Now what I'm looking for is grease to come out of every roller bearing on the side. And once I see that, I know it's packed. Now the top one needs a little manual packing, so I'm going to do it off camera. But these bearings are all set to be installed. I actually have a video of manually packing bearings, so look into my channel and you can find it. Now over here I had a handful of grease, and what I'm doing is I'm putting a film of grease all around every surface area that you can see. Therefore, if water were to get inside, at least that film of grease is going to keep anything from rusting. Now you might see in other cars that there's just going to be a blob of grease inside, but to be more thorough, you want every surface area to have at least a film of grease. Now after I grease the hub, I'm going to install the inner bearing. I'm going to give it a spin and make sure it sits well inside before I put the inner seal on. See how it spins? Now I'm going to install the seal. Now usually people use a block of wood, but I have adapters where I could place on top of the seal and just tap it in. See, this is the perfect size of the seal. And I'm going to get a little mallet actually a big mallet. And now I'm going to tap it in. And you're going to hear a difference in sound once it's seated. Now double check one more time. And if it's seated, now you can proceed lubricating the spindle. Now over here, you see I put grease all over the spindle. Not too much, but a decent amount. And make sure where the seal sits, there's a light film around it, because the seal is actually going to spin on it and it's pretty much rubbing. So if it's dry, that's where the seal fails and then water can get in. Now as I install the rotor, what I'm feeling for is the inner seal to sit on that ring on the spindle. And after it sits there, it should stay in place. Now it's the outside bearing. I'm going to give it a spin, make sure everything sits well. I'm going to install the washer. And then the retaining nut. Now with the retaining nut, what I'm going to do is I'm going to preload as I'm spinning the opposite way. So I hand tight it, and I'm going to use the pliers. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to tighten and loosen as I'm spinning the rotor, and that ensures that the bearings are actually sitting properly. So as you're tightening, you can feel the rotor is going to slow down. So I'm going to give it a little preload, and I'm actually going to back out afterwards. So that little backing out is just enough for me. So here's the retaining nut. I'm going to check the free play. There should be no free play horizontally or vertically. Now to the cotter pins. To the left is a regular cotter pin, and to the right is a hammer lock cotter pin. I'm going to be using both so you can see how it's installed. Now there's so many ways of installing the cotter pin, but I'm going to show you how I do it, and you'll be the judge. So with the regular cotter pin, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to flare out both ends. Now if this cotter pin was just half an inch shorter, I would stop right there and I don't have to close it up. But because it's a bit longer, I'm going to use pliers. I'm going to close it up. As long as it doesn't interfere with the dust cap. Now here's the finishing result. Now with the hammer lock cotter pin. Now you see the back of the hammer lock? Now as you stick it in, it's going to face outwards. As it faces outwards, I'm just going to fold the first leg over. After I fold the first leg over, I'm going to make sure it rests at the tip of the spindle so it doesn't interfere with the dust cap. And then I'm going to cut the bottom. And that way it makes it easier to remove the next time. I notice a lot of old timers prefer this method, but honestly, it's personal preference. Now for the dust cap, I like to have a little grease on the outside lip and the inside. So if any water gets in, it has to penetrate that film of grease before it rusts anything else. Now with the mallet, tap it in. And that's your finishing product. Thank you very much for staying till the end. Now what I went over is a general idea of servicing wheel bearings. But honestly, there's so much more that I can go over. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll be making more in the future. If you haven't yet, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.